Thanks very much for that introduction. Before I get to my talk, I put all those things in about York University because I knew what was going on here from the York administration directed against the students against Israeli apartheid. And I have an MA from York, and an honors BA from York, and a BA from York, and I was editor of Excalibur, and news editor, and sports editor, and 2 years on the York University Student Federation. It was called something different back then. And so I've got York credentials, a lot of York credentials. I'm ashamed of the York University administration. I'm ashamed of what they've been doing to this wonderful movement and this wonderful meeting. They are now standing alone, as they have the honor now of being the worst university administration when it comes to freedom of speech on political issues in the entire country of Canada. I hope that gets recorded. I hope that gets put in the articles that are written, because this is shameful. The next time that I get a fundraising letter from York University, I'm going to tell them exactly why I'm not giving them any money. Actually, I'll make one exception. I'll say, I'll give you some money if you listen to the third speaker on this panel and follow her advice. But then we'll get to that later. Okay. So York's complicity in apartheid, I'm going to contextualize this by talking about putting it in the context of Canada's complicity with the what's going on in Palestine, Israel-Palestine. In the news today, North Africa and the Middle East are in the news today. Muammar Gaddafi is killing civilians in Libya. There's a lot of press about it. He doesn't know anything about, well, he could take lessons. Because Israel, around which there is much less publicity when Israel does things like this, has a long history of killing civilians. 2010, May, last year, a peaceful convoy on its way to Gaza to lift the siege of Gaza, attacked in open seas by the Israeli Defense Force. Civilians killed, 9 Turkish civilians killed in the Mavi Marmara. 2008, 2009, the war on Gaza, which is an open-air prison, which is illegally surrounded, formerly occupied, and now actually, in international law, it's still occupied, but actually surrounded by Israel. In that war, in 2008, 2009, 13 Israeli soldiers died. And we don't know exactly how many people in Gaza died. The low figure is 1,100. The middle figure is 1,400, and the high figure is 1,800, of whom at least 300 were children, and only about 400 were combatants. The vast majority of the people killed in the completely one-sided assault on Gaza were civilians. The state of Israel is an expert at killing civilians. You go to 2006, in the war on Lebanon in 2006. In that war, a few more IDF soldiers died, 121 died. In that war, they killed 1,191 Lebanese civilians and 500 combatants. The great fear, and I remember that war very well in 2006, the great fear that we all had was that it might be worse, far worse. Because when you go back to the early 80s, when you go back to 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, it was a humanitarian catastrophe. 20,000 people killed in that war. An absolute slaughter. And at the end of it, the barbarism that happened at the camps in Sabra and Shatila, where the Israeli Defense Force held the gates, stood by with their arms crossed, while the fascist gangs went in and slaughtered people in their beds, completely defenseless. The fighters were gone. The people with the guns were gone from those camps. They slaughtered families in their beds at night. So this is a state that knows how to kill civilians. But we don't get the same press around Israel for the last 25 years that we're getting today around Libya. And don't get me wrong, I think Gaddafi should go, but that's a whole other story. How do Canadian politicians respond? The issue is complicity. So what's Canada's response to this killing of civilians? In 2006, Stephen Harper, when confronted with the war in Lebanon, said that he thought And remember the figures, 1,800 people killed by Israel. He said the response was measured. What was he measuring? He might want to have asked some of the dissident Israeli soldiers who went into Lebanon to fight the war on the side of Israel, but became so appalled at the barbarism of the tactics of the Israeli Defense Force that they went public. And some of the things they went public with should make your skin crawl. I've got the quote here, I'll just paraphrase. A young officer in the Israeli army said, "What we did was a crime. What we did was barbarism." As the war ended, and Israel was pushed back, they didn't get the war they wanted. They were fought to a standstill by Hezbollah in the war in Lebanon in 2006. As they left, their revenge they left was launching cluster bombs. We don't know how many cluster bombs they left behind. According to this young dissident Israeli soldier who was so horrified that he went public with it, he said, "I think about 1.2 million. Cluster bombs are mines. They're little things that sit in the ground that look pretty. And you pick them up and they explode and they maim you or kill you." Canada has signed the convention. Canada was one of the big leaders in the fight against to make landmines illegal. Seeding the ground with cluster bombs is in effect putting mines in the ground where people farm, where people live, where people walk, where people take transportation, where people take the kids to school. It's a war crime. For Stephen Harper, this is a measured response. Peter Kent, another Tory, said in 2010, he said that an attack on Israel is an attack on Canada. That's an interesting thing to say. Let's just, quite apart from the ideology and the politics of it, let's just parse this out. I'm sorry, I'm a political scientist. I was trained at York, in York Political Science. Lovely department. I have nothing against York Political Science. Great place. Learned a lot of good things, York Political Science. So let's think about an attack on Israel as an attack on Canada. You have to ask the question, what is Israel? To do that, you actually have to study. You have to study the Hague Convention of 1907, for instance. The Hague Convention of 1907 says that at the end of a war, when a military victor is occupying territory, controlling the population, controlling the economy, controlling the ports, controlling the roads, they have responsibility for the people in that territory. And in international law, when an occupation goes on and on and on and on, when you talk about the people of Israel, you cannot just talk about the people who are formally citizens of Israel. Israel is responsible not just for its citizens. It is responsible for the West Bank, which it occupies. It is responsible for the Golan Heights, which it occupies. It's responsible for Gaza, which it surrounds now, but in effect occupies by controlling the airspace, etc. So an attack on Israel is an attack on its people, is an attack on Canada, but when the attack on Gaza happened, which is an attack on Israel, under international law, nothing from Canada. Nothing. Silence. Because they don't really mean an attack on Israel as an attack on Canada. They mean an attack on the state that they support in Israel, and they differentiate between certain citizens. Some of the citizens in Israel they see as good citizens, and some of the people in Israel they see as bad citizens. How does Israel get away with this? How does Israel do this? Well, before they get away with it, how does it accomplish this? Some of these facts we should burn into our brains. It's a tiny country, 7 million people. It receives $3 billion a year in arms assistance from the United States. This has allowed it to be the 12th largest, it has the 12th largest arms budget in the world. It's a tiny country. It's the world's 8th largest arms exporter. In terms of nuclear weapons, it is the 5th biggest nuclear power in the world. It has almost as many nuclear weapons as France, more than Britain, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Now, there's a lot of press about the dangers that we face in the Middle East. We might have problems with nuclear weapons in a repressive state called Iran. Well, actually, we don't have to wait for the future. We have problems with 200 or 300 nuclear weapons in a repressive state called Israel. And if you look for the problems of weapons of mass destruction, they exist in Israel. We get into trouble in Canada when we call this apartheid. This is actually the best way of unpacking Canada's complicity is looking at the response that's happened over the last 7 years with this term Israeli apartheid, which is a beautiful term. is a beautiful term for a simple reason, because it's true. It simply says the truth. What is apartheid? Apartheid emerges as a term in South Africa in the context of the racial, the forced legal and racially organized segregation between the non-white population and the white population, and the bizarre series of gradations of types of persons that exist in South Africa. It has long since become a general term for discussing those kinds of unjustified separations between peoples on the basis of trivial differences. Because when you think about it biologically and anthropologically, skin color, I mean, it's like separating this room on the basis of blue eyes and brown eyes or green eyes. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Or people who have retained their hair into their 50s and people, I mean, you think about it. Ethnically based, racially based separation called apartheid, we now call Jim Crow experience in the United States. It's commonly called apartheid. What happened there?